Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya, and you're watching the Eastern Express. It's May 9th, which means it's once again time for Russia's favorite annual cosplay convention, Victory Day, the day Moscow reminds the world that technically they were the good guys in 1945 while absolutely failing to act like it in 2025. Today is when Red Square gets filled with tanks, missiles, and foreign dignitaries who owe Putin a favor. Victory Day in Russia has always been about two things: glorifying the Soviet past and whitewashing the bloody present. And this year's parade has a little extra glitter, thanks to theatrical ceasefire, awkward guest lists, and the threat of drone strikes. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Victory Day in Moscow's Red Square. This is one of the most important celebrations in the Russian calendar. It marks the defeat of what is regarded as the greatest existential threat to the Russian state, Nazi Germany. It can also be considered the day when the Soviet Union became one of the world's two leading powers. So it's no wonder that Vladimir Putin wants to use the occasion to showcase what he sees as Russian leadership on the international stage. Many foreign dignitaries, such as the Chinese president, attended the celebrations.
The past decade saw major turbulence and transformation in the international landscape, but also saw significant development and great strides in China-Russia relations.
Almost all of Russia's closest partners are present at the event. The Ukrainian president has spared no harsh words towards their attendance and what could be seen as a kind of endorsement of the Russian invasion.
The organizer of the mass graves in Bucha will speak about the atrocities of the Nazis. And those who organized the blockade of Mariupol will speak about the blockade of Leningrad. It will be a parade of cynicism.
This day has more than just historical meaning, however. Russian propaganda narratives have often compared what is called the Great Patriotic War in Russia to the invasion of Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have either died or been wounded in the conflict of Moscow's own making. The Kremlin is pushing these outlandish comparisons to stir up a sense of national pride among the population. Though that national pride won't bring back the men sent to die in a pointless conflict driven by the vanity of one man.
Now let's zone in on the east-planing portion of our show. Although the Soviet Union and the Western Allies fought on the same side of World War II, they celebrate victory over Nazi Germany on different days. While in the West, VE Day is held on May 8, Russia and some former Soviet countries celebrate it on May 9.
When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the landscape of the Second World War irreversibly changed. Almost 4 years later, Berlin was captured and Adolf Hitler was dead by suicide. Germany officially capitulated on the night between May 8th and May 9th of 1945. While it was still May 8th in Western Europe, it was already May 9th in Russia, hence the Russians celebrate a day later. For the Russians, this day has historically been an opportunity to showcase their power. Parades often involve hundreds of vehicles and soldiers, making the entire affair a very militarized one. In the West, the occasion is much more contained when it comes to military prowess. There are still flyovers and soldiers and some equipment, but it is seen as a much more joyous occasion, a time to celebrate hard-won freedom, to be with loved ones and with children for whose futures many had fought during those 6 years.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia announced a unilateral humanitarian truce from May 8 to May 11, a ceasefire that's not so much humanitarian as it is, please don't embarrass us in front of Xi Jinping. Now, this isn't the first time that Russia's tried this kind of PR stunt, but it's certainly one of the more desperate. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine didn't play along. President Zelensky dismissed the so-called truce as a theatrical performance. So while Moscow was getting the tanks out and the soldiers ready, Ukraine has spent the week giving them an aerial encore of You Started It, the drone remix. Now, if you're thinking that that seems dangerous with all those foreign leaders attending, you'd be right. Zelensky even warned that Ukraine cannot guarantee the safety of foreign officials on Russian territory, which again is basically him saying, you go to that parade, you're on your own, pal. But go they did, at least some of them. According to Russian state media, over 24 world leaders have showed up at the Red Square. Among the most high-profile guests is Chinese President Xi Jinping, making his second visit to Moscow since re-election. He's planning to stay a day past the parade to sign a bunch of bilateral agreements and quietly remind Vladimir Putin who the real daddy is in this relationship. China, of course, claims to be neutral in the war, while simultaneously becoming the largest supplier of dual-use goods for Russian weapons manufacturing. And tensions between Ukraine and China? Let's just say that Zelensky recently said 155 Chinese nationals were fighting for Russia. The next day, Ukraine captured 2 of them in Donetsk. China's response? Who? Us? Never heard of those guys. Now, only one EU leader attended, Slovakia's Robert Fico, and even he was reported he could skip the event due to health issues. So who else came? Well, a dazzling lineup of presidents, prime ministers, and strongmen from places like Equatorial Guinea, Myanmar, and North Korea. There was even troops from 13 different countries marching, including Laos, Tajikistan, and Vietnam. And to protect all these very important people, Russia is locking down its cities. On May 7, mobile internet was restricted across Moscow and beyond. Dmitry Peskov blamed, quote, dangerous neighbors, which is Kremlin speak for our own civilians with working brains. So to sum it up, Russia is hosting its annual parade of myth-making and military hardware. It's invited the International Hall of Shame, and it's desperately trying to make the world forget that it's still in the middle of a genocidal war. Victory Day used to be about honoring the past. Now, it's a grotesque pantomime to distract from the present. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Mark McNamee, co-founder at the Ukraine Business News Network. Mark, it's good to have you with us here on Eastern Express.
Thanks, good to be here.
Now, let's start with the obvious. So Russia says, we're seeing this glorious Victory Day parade. Now, Russia says the parade honors victory over fascism. But given what's happening in Ukraine, isn't that like hosting a peace summit in a weapons factory?
It's a nice analogy. It's just that they can't even fake that this is that they're interested at all in peace, and that's proof of this parade. One, they Putin insincerely offered a ceasefire over these days, not because he's actually genuinely interested in peace, but he's interested in making sure he can hold this dramatic celebration in peace and no threats to himself or to any of his Xi Jinping or any of the other guests. And then also, they haven't abided by the ceasefire at all. And then they're showing this demonstration, or at least attempting to show this demonstration of force and support by various allies who are in attendance. Obviously, this is not showing any demonstration that they're interested in ending the war or pushing towards peace, particularly when the U.S. has been trying to cajole Putin and Russia into peace talks for over a month now, and they've shown demonstrably zero interest. This is classic Russian propaganda, classic Russian just boastfulness, trying to overwhelm and bluff and scare adversaries through a show of force. And so this is their opportunity on May 9th. But to any onlookers, anybody with the slightest education in the war and Russia's manpower losses and materiel losses, this is not a show of strength. This is a show of scarcity, we should say, in terms of the lack of vehicles, of tanks in particular. Famously, last year's May 9th parade had one tank, a World War II era tank, in fact, which they were trying to be nostalgic about, but it unfortunately demonstrated the other point, which is they don't have the vehicles to even march in a parade because they have deficits at the front itself. So there you go.
If I can summarize everything you said in one word, I think I would call it theatrics. Mark, let me ask you, you mentioned a couple of interesting points here, but let me start with China here. Now, Xi Jinping, which you mentioned, made this trip to Moscow. What message would you say that China is sending by marching alongside of Vladimir Putin during this war it claims to be neutral in? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct, right. And they claimed, at least under Biden's administration, claimed to be more or less on the fence. Obviously, we know from their rhetoric, they are always interested in opposing what they described as U.S. hegemony over the last 30 plus years. Putin in the war in Ukraine, Russia's doing this very clearly and publicly, globally. China was happy to allow Russia to play that role, but didn't want to overstep its bounds. Now, under a Trump administration, clearly we're seeing something slightly different. For one, you have an enormous amount of Chinese troops who will be marching through Red Square lockstep with Russian troops. So just the symbolism there is quite telling. And then the rhetoric we've heard out of Xi Jinping relatively recently, of course, on the heels of the Trump trade war, and very pointedly, when Trump reduced the tariffs on the rest of the global economy, but maintained them and escalated them against China specifically, the gloves are off. I think for Xi Jinping, he believes he can not only can he win this trade war, but he can be now more openly, more overtly supportive of Russia. That doesn't mean they send Chinese troops to Ukraine. That doesn't mean they send even military equipment directly to Russia to support the war. But they can just be more brazenly open about the fact that they do more or less, at least somewhat indirectly through component parts, dual-use goods, and the like, are willing to support Russia. And we saw this with just this week, announced the Power of Two Siberia gas pipeline, initial discussions, which Russia's been begging for years. It's not coincidental that the timing happened to coincide with Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow and the May 9th parade.
So, Mark, would you say that with everything that you just mentioned, that we can now see a pivot point where Russia becomes more economically and militarily dependent on China?
Most definitely. And frankly, I mean, whether Russia likes that or not, and I think they're actually somewhat comfortable with that, considering all the external conditions, going forward, that's only going to worsen for Russia, which, again, there are no other real alternatives. There are no other available options for Russia to pursue if, and this is obviously the assumption, Putin and the Kremlin maintain this singular focus on the war in Ukraine, which we should expect that they will for the coming years, for the next generation. Mm-hmm. And so that being the case, they have no other alternatives than to continue to put themselves into China's hands and rely even further. And Xi Jinping is well aware of this, of course, too. So then the real question here is not what does Russia do or how are they going to behave in the future? The real question is how is Xi Jinping going to respond to this, and how will he balance this relationship of Russia with China's relationship with Europe and the United States? Mm-hmm. What we've seen here in the last 10 days or so is that he's happy to brazenly, overtly oppose the United States more strongly under a Trump administration, which he may not have done so clearly under Biden's administration.
Mark, let's talk about the guest list for a moment. I mean, aside from Xi Jinping, I mean, what do you make of it? I mean, we also had Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico attending, who, is the only European leader to travel to Moscow. What do you make of this?
Not terribly surprising. I mean, Putin, of course, we don't know exactly what happened behind the scenes, but Putin is desperate to show as much international support for his regime as he can. And so we don't know exactly all the details of what Russia did to maybe cajole or encourage these guys to come there, because there is a political cost somewhat. Nothing extreme, of course, but there must be some political cost for Vučić, for Fico, to show up in Moscow on this day during the war amid such tension between Russia and the West, amid these ceasefire talks that Putin isn't agreeing to or abiding by at all. There is somewhat of a political cost. So what was the real benefit for Fico and Vučić to really go against a prevailing Western and specifically European policy and support Putin? I think quite clearly there's a very strong personal relationship. There's a lot of cajoling going on behind the scenes to just show up, and just that symbolic act of having European actors helping that propaganda out of the Kremlin that Russia does have allies in Europe that they could rely upon and even invite for one of the most important national holidays in Russia to show support, which, again, the propaganda is to show the West is weak, the West is divided, and this plays into Putin's hands perfectly. It's just that we in the West shouldn't be interpreting this Kremlin propaganda.
But doesn't Moscow feel that it's isolated?
I think they understand in reality that they are more or less isolated, but if they can show cosmetically, at least the optics, that they are not so isolated, that goes a long way for Western audiences. Maybe some less educated viewers in the United States or in Western Europe who see some of these European leaders going there, it kind of puts a nicer face onto Putin. If he's accepted by a couple of European leaders and Xi Jinping, maybe he's not seen as such an evil guy. This never would have happened, for example, in the Soviet Union, right? It couldn't have possibly happened. Mm-hmm. But maybe, Putin, that kind of whitewashes his image a little bit to Western audiences, which is, of course, Kremlin propaganda.
Mark, at the parade, Putin used his speech to draw a direct line between World War II and the war in Ukraine. I quote specifically, he said, "Truth and justice are on our side," insisting that the entire country, society, and people support the participants of the war in Ukraine. Now, what's the danger of Russia actually hijacking this historical memory to justify its ongoing aggression on Ukraine?
Well, the danger has already come to fruition. We've already seen it because Kremlin propaganda works. And the first person Kremlin propaganda works for is Putin himself, who very likely, and his closest allies, believe their own propaganda. But then secondly, Kremlin propaganda works on the Russian population. And this includes educated people who we would say should probably know better otherwise. People who have lived abroad, people who know multiple languages, people who've worked for Western corporations, et cetera, they still buy into a lot of these propaganda messages because they resonate with Russia's history and feelings of nostalgia and what people would want to believe. When you attach the current war to something so central to Russia's identity as the Great Fatherland War, the World War II, this obviously is extremely compelling for the Russian people. And so this keeps up generalized support. A lot of that is maybe passive support, or a lot of it is just sort of Russians maybe wanting to just happily stay out of the trenches, stay out of prison, and more or less keep quiet and just sort of mildly support and embrace Russian imperialism. That's good enough for Putin. That's enough apathy and enough very, very passive support to keep the war going and to keep enough domestic stability there. So it's unfortunately works very successfully. Your question is the perfect one, because before the war, attacking Ukrainians, just the premise of killing people who Putin had said, well, they're our brothers, and Ukrainians are actually truly just deeply confused Russians. It's hard to justify then invading the country and killing your brethren, killing people who you conceive of as Russians. But the way you can do it is by attaching that narrative to World War II and identifying them as Nazis and traitors to the Russian state, which then that was the compelling narrative. And that was a critical turn to see if could the Kremlin get the Russian population on its side for the war, and that's how they did it.
And you most definitely said it perfectly, that Kremlin propaganda, unfortunately, does really work. Thank you so much, Mark McNamee, co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network, for being with us here and sharing all your insight on Eastern Express. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The European Union continues to support Ukraine in its defensive efforts against Russia. The country has received over $1 billion from the EU under the G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration, or ERA, initiative.
The current injection of funds is the fourth such sum that the EU has sent to Ukraine. This money is secured by proceeds from frozen Russian assets. The European Commission's total loans to Ukraine under the initiative have reached almost $7 billion since the start of the current year. Ukrainian authorities have already explained that the money will be used to cover critical budget expenditure and strengthen the operations of the Ukrainian state. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, G7 countries have frozen some $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets. The ERA initiative, which is backed by the US and the EU, is aimed at using the profits generated by these assets to finance not just Ukraine's defense, but also its future reconstruction.
Lithuania's parliament has approved the government's withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention. The agreement prohibits the use of anti-personnel mines, which Lithuania wants to use on its border to deter a potential Russian attack.
Only 3 Lithuanian MPs abstained from the vote and none opposed a motion to step away from the Ottawa Convention. The decision will take full effect 6 months from now, which also gives Lithuania plenty of time to manufacture or procure the mines it is interested in. It is also not the only country to have recently abandoned the Ottawa Convention, as the other Baltic states and Poland also announced their intention to withdraw from it. What's more, Lithuania's parliament also recently unanimously adopted a resolution in which it declared that Vilnius will never recognize the Ukrainian territory seized by Russia, neither legally nor in practice. This comes amid reports that a possible peace deal between Russia and Ukraine could involve Kiev giving up certain, if not all, parts of the land that Russian forces captured during the war.
Armenian public opinion seems to be set against the government's current U-turn when it comes to geopolitics, a recent survey shows. Yerevan has been looking to step away from its traditional alliance with Russia and work more with the EU and the United States.
It seems that in Armenia, old geopolitical habits are very difficult to break. For the last year and a half or so, the country's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has been making overtures to the West and trying to normalize relations with Armenia's greatest rival, Azerbaijan. The people, however, aren't as optimistic about these changes as the government seems to be. For example, Armenian society is essentially evenly split when it comes to whether they think that Armenia's EU process will ever be successful. What's more, 60% of respondents were open to the idea of Russia's continued involvement in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace negotiations, and 62% approved of Pashinyan attending Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. Armenia and Moscow held close ties until Azerbaijan captured the Nagorno-Karabakh region in a lightning offensive in late 2023, while Russian peacekeepers did nothing to prevent it. Since then, relations have soured, and Yerevan has been looking for alternative allies.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. I'm Diana Skaya, and stay with us here on TVP World.